It was just another normal day for Maya Thompson, an FBI agent known for her professionalism and dedication. She had been working tirelessly on a case that was important to her, and her mind was focused on getting things done. Maya was a woman who had spent years in the FBI, learning how to handle tough situations with calm and precision. But today was different. She was driving through the quiet streets of the city, her car smoothly humming along the road, when she noticed the flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. It was a police car. Maya glanced at the mirror again and saw the officer's stern face as he signaled her to pull over. At first, she didn't think much of it. After all, everyone gets stopped by the police now and then. Maya slowed her car and parked at the side of the road. She could already feel her heart rate pick up, but she knew she had to stay calm. As an FBI agent, she was used to unexpected situations, but this felt different. The officer who approached her wasn't smiling, and his eyes seemed focused on her in a way that made her feel uneasy. "Good afternoon, officer," Maya greeted him politely, rolling down her window. "License and registration." The officer snapped, not acknowledging her greeting. Maya felt the tension in his voice, and she could sense that something wasn't right. She calmly handed over her license and registration, but before she could explain anything, the officer's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You're an FBI agent, huh?" he asked, his tone dripping with doubt. "Yes, I am," Maya replied, showing him her badge. She expected him to recognize her credentials and treat her with the respect that she was accustomed to. But instead, the officer seemed even more skeptical. "An FBI agent driving through here. What's your real story?" the officer muttered, looking at her with distrust. Maya was taken aback. She was used to people being surprised by her job, but this officer wasn't just surprised. He seemed to be suspicious of her for no reason at all. She tried to stay calm and explained that she was on a personal break, just passing through the area. But the officer wasn't listening. He stood there, staring at her as if she were lying. Maya knew that something wasn't right. She was trained to deal with all sorts of situations, but this felt different. This wasn't about law enforcement. It was about something deeper. It was as if the officer had already decided what kind of person she was, simply based on her appearance. "I'm going to need to run your information," the officer said, his voice sharp. Maya felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest, but she held it in. This wasn't the time to argue. She watched as he walked back to his car, still giving her suspicious looks. Maya sat in her car, her mind racing. Why was this happening? She had done nothing wrong. She was an officer just like him. But the officer's attitude was clear. He saw her as someone who didn't belong. And in that moment, Maya knew this encounter was going to take a turn she never expected. Maya sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The officer had been rude, and his behavior had made her uncomfortable. As she waited for him to return, she thought about all the times she had been stopped by law enforcement in her career as an FBI agent. Usually, it was professional, quick, and respectful. But this was different. After what felt like an eternity, the officer returned to her window, holding her license and registration in his hands. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her with a look of disbelief on his face. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered suddenly. Maya blinked, caught off guard. "What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his tone sharp and firm. There was no room for discussion. Maya didn't want to escalate things, but she couldn't help feeling a wave of anger rising inside her. She was an FBI agent, a law enforcement officer just like him. Why was he treating her this way? But she knew that arguing wouldn't help, especially with an officer who seemed to be set on causing trouble. She slowly opened the door and stepped out of her car. The officer immediately reached for his handcuffs, making Maya's heart race. She was confused and frustrated, but she knew she had to remain calm. "I'm an FBI agent," she said again, trying to reason with him. You can check my credentials if you want." But the officer ignored her. "You're under arrest," he announced coldly, slapping the handcuffs on her wrists with no hesitation. Maya's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. She had been arrested before in her line of duty, but this time it was different. This wasn't about doing her job. It was about the officer's clear bias. He wasn't arresting her because of anything she had done wrong. He was arresting her because of who she was. "This is illegal," Maya said, her voice steady but firm. "You can't do this." But the officer didn't listen. He ignored her protest and shoved her gently toward his patrol car. Maya couldn't believe it. How could this be happening? She was a trained FBI agent, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. As the officer drove her to the station, Maya's thoughts raced. She couldn't wait to get to the station and clear this up. She knew that once her superiors were involved, everything would be sorted out quickly. But right now, she had to stay calm. She couldn't let this officer see her weakness. She had to handle this professionally, just as she had been trained to do. As they arrived at the police station, Maya was led inside, her hands still cuffed. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. This officer's actions were completely wrong, and she would make sure that he was held accountable. But for now, she had to wait. The wheels of justice would turn slowly, but they would turn. And when they did, Officer Harris would have to face the consequences of his actions. Maya sat in the back of the patrol car, her mind racing. Her wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, but it was the sense of injustice that bothered her the most. How could this be happening? She had worked hard her entire life to get to where she was, only to be arrested for doing nothing wrong. She couldn't shake the thought of Officer Harris's cold, suspicious gaze when he first approached her. It was as if he had already decided who she was before she even had a chance to explain herself. The car stopped in front of the police station, and Maya's stomach tightened. She was being taken inside, but she refused to let the officer see her frustration. She knew the best way to handle this situation was to remain calm, even if everything inside her was boiling with anger. As she stepped out of the car, the officer guided her inside the station, his hand on her arm. Maya didn't say anything. There was nothing more to say for now. She knew the situation would eventually be cleared up. She just needed to get to the right people. Inside the station, Maya was led to a holding room, still handcuffed. The cold, sterile walls and the bright lights didn't help calm her nerves. She glanced around the room, trying to find something familiar in this strange, uncomfortable place. She had worked with law enforcement officers all over the country, but being in a holding room herself felt completely different. Officer Harris left the room, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall. Maya was left alone, the silence pressing in around her. She took a deep breath, trying to center herself. She had been through tough situations before, but this was personal. This wasn't just about following procedure or getting through a challenging case. This was about standing up against something far bigger: prejudice. Maya's thoughts turned to her family, her friends, and all the people who would be supporting her. She knew she wasn't alone. She had worked hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't going to let one officer's prejudice define her or bring her down. As time passed, Maya thought about what she should do next. Should she speak out right away or wait until her superiors arrived? She knew it was important to stay patient, but the injustice was hard to ignore. Every minute that passed, the anger inside her grew, but she kept her emotions in check. She had to stay strong. She knew that once the right people were involved, this situation would be handled. Her superior would be on the way, and her credentials would quickly clear up any confusion. But Maya wasn't just waiting for someone else to fix things. She knew that when the time came, she would take the necessary steps to make sure Officer Harris was held accountable for his actions. Maya sat there for what felt like hours, but she refused to let herself break down. She was a professional, and no matter how hard this was, she wouldn't let it defeat her. This was just one battle in a much larger war, and Maya was ready to fight for what was right. As the minutes ticked by, Maya sat in the cold holding room, her mind racing. She was used to taking charge of difficult situations, but this was different. She had never been on the other side of an arrest. The confusion and frustration of it all made her pulse quicken, but she knew she had to stay calm. The one thing she could count on in this moment was her training and the knowledge that she wasn't alone. Her thoughts turned to her superior at the FBI, a person who had always supported her throughout her career. Maya knew that once they were informed, everything would be set right. But the question was, how long would it take for them to come? She couldn't let herself dwell on that. The more she thought about it, the more impatient she became. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Maya decided it was time to make the call. She knew she had to reach out for help and get the ball rolling. She took a deep breath and picked up the phone that was sitting on the small table in front of her. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she steadied herself and dialed her superior's number. The phone rang a few times before someone picked up. Maya. Her superior's voice came through clearly, the concern in their tone immediately evident. "What's going on? I just heard what happened. Are you okay?" Maya felt a rush of relief wash over her at the sound of their voice. It was as though the tension that had built up in her chest was starting to ease. "I'm fine," Maya said, her voice steady despite the situation. "But I've been arrested by a police officer here. He's accusing me of something I didn't do. He didn't believe I was an FBI agent, even after I showed him my badge. And now, I'm stuck in a holding room at the station." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Maya could almost hear her superior processing the information. "This is outrageous," her superior finally said. "We're going to fix this. I'm calling in support from the department, and I'll make sure you're released immediately. Just stay calm, Maya. We've got this." Maya felt a sense of gratitude flood through her. She knew that her superior had her back, and that meant everything. But it wasn't just about her being released. It was about making sure the officer who had wrongfully arrested her would face consequences for his actions. She wasn't going to let this go. "I'm staying calm," Maya assured them. "But I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I don't know what's going on with this officer, but I can't just forget about this." "I understand," her superior replied. "And we won't let this go. We'll make sure this is handled properly. Stay strong, Maya. We'll be there as soon as we can." As the call ended, Maya felt a new sense of resolve. Her superior's support had given her the strength to push forward. She wasn't just going to let this be another story of an officer getting away with wrongful actions. Maya had spent her career fighting for justice, and now she was going to make sure it was served. She leaned back in her chair and took a deep breath. It wouldn't be long before help arrived. And when it did, things would begin to change. The news of Maya's arrest spread quickly. Within hours, social media posts and news outlets were buzzing with the story. The story of a black FBI agent being wrongfully arrested by a local police officer caught the attention of many. People were shocked, outraged, and confused. How could something like this happen in today's world? Maya sat in a holding room, unaware of the growing public response. All she could focus on was the phone call she had made to her superior, the promise of support, and the quiet hope that the situation would be cleared up soon. But outside the police station, things were moving quickly. News outlets began picking up the story, and reporters started asking questions. Some were shocked by the officer's actions, while others questioned how such a mistake could happen. Social media was flooded with posts, tweets, and comments from people across the country. Many people expressed their disbelief and anger, sharing their support for Maya. Across the country, people were starting to talk about the incident. Activists, leaders, and everyday people began sharing their thoughts. They called out the officer's behavior and demanded accountability. It was clear that Maya's situation wasn't just about her. It was about a larger problem. In the midst of all this, Maya remained calm. She didn't know yet how the public outcry would affect her case, but she knew one thing for sure. The truth was on her side. She had been wronged, but she was not alone. People were speaking out on her behalf, and that gave her the strength to keep going. When Maya finally heard that the news had spread, she wasn't surprised. It was a huge story, an FBI agent wrongfully arrested by a police officer. But what surprised her was the overwhelming support she began to receive from the public. Messages poured in, both from strangers and from colleagues who had worked with her in the past. Many expressed their disbelief that something like this could happen, while others shared their own experiences of unfair treatment. Maya felt a mixture of emotions. She was grateful for the support, but also saddened that it had to come to this. The attention was both comforting and overwhelming. Still, she remained focused on the task at hand. The officer's actions needed to be addressed, and she was determined to make sure they were. Meanwhile, as the public reacted, the police station began feeling the pressure. The officer's colleagues were starting to question his actions, and the department had no choice but to respond. It wasn't long before a statement was made, acknowledging that the arrest had been a mistake, but the damage had already been done. The public had made it clear that this wasn't something they would just let go. Maya knew that this incident was just the beginning. The outcry had already forced a conversation about race, bias, and the need for change. She couldn't help but think that maybe this moment, though painful for her, was part of something much bigger. A chance to make a difference, to shed light on an issue that needed to be addressed. As she sat in that holding room, Maya realized that while she had been wronged, this moment could spark the change needed for justice to be done. And that made everything worth it. As the hours went by, the pressure on Officer Harris grew. News outlets, social media, and even local activists were demanding answers. People across the country were speaking out, calling for accountability. Many were outraged that a police officer would arrest an FBI agent for no reason other than bias. The story was spreading fast, and the officer could feel the weight of the situation. Meanwhile, Maya sat in the holding room, still waiting for her superior and the support from her department. She knew the situation would be resolved soon, but the public response was starting to take on a life of its own. Maya was becoming a symbol of something larger, something much bigger than the individual arrest. It was about the broader issue of fairness and the need for change in law enforcement. At the police station, Officer Harris tried to defend himself, but his words weren't convincing. He told his colleagues that he had acted in good faith, but his explanation was weak. He claimed that Maya's behavior had seemed suspicious and that he hadn't been able to verify her credentials in time. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that his actions weren't based on reasonable suspicion. They were based on his assumptions about Maya. The officer had made a snap judgment, one that was colored by his own biases. Colleagues and superiors at the station began to question his version of events. The story didn't add up. How could a seasoned officer, someone who had worked in law enforcement for years, not recognize an FBI badge? How could he treat a fellow officer like a criminal without any real cause? Harris's story was starting to fall apart, and the pressure was mounting. The department was forced to respond. They issued a statement acknowledging that the arrest had been a mistake, but many people weren't satisfied with that. The public wasn't going to let this go with just an apology. The officer had to be held accountable for his actions. As the situation continued to unfold, Officer Harris' defensiveness grew. He didn't understand why people were so upset. He claimed he had been doing his job, but he was missing the bigger picture. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about the way he had treated Maya because of her race. His inability to recognize his own bias was becoming more and more obvious. Maya, on the other hand, knew what she had to do. She wasn't interested in defending herself. She was interested in making sure that something like this didn't happen again. She knew that change could only come if the system was willing to face the truth about its flaws, and she was determined to be part of that change. With the public continuing to speak out, the pressure on Officer Harris increased. He tried to deflect blame, but his attempts were weak and unconvincing. People were starting to see the truth, and Maya's voice, though quiet for now, was becoming louder than ever. She wasn't just a victim of an unjust arrest. She was becoming the face of the fight for justice. Maya sat silently in her holding room, confident that the truth would eventually win. She had the support of the public, and soon her superiors would be there to back her up. She wasn't going to let this go until the right thing was done. The pressure was building on Officer Harris. News outlets and social media were relentless, demanding answers. Public support for Maya grew stronger with each passing hour. Her story wasn't just about one wrongfully arrested FBI agent. It was about the need for fairness and accountability in law enforcement. Maya had become a symbol of the fight against bias and prejudice, and the nation was listening. Inside the police station, things were starting to change. The department, realizing the gravity of the situation, launched an internal investigation into Officer Harris's actions. As part of the investigation, they reviewed body cam footage, spoke to witnesses, and began to piece together what had really happened during Maya's arrest. It didn't take long for the truth to come to light. The officer's actions had been unjust, and his decision to arrest Maya had been made without any reasonable cause. Maya knew that this would be the turning point. The department was now forced to acknowledge that they couldn't ignore what had happened. The truth was clear. Officer Harris had let his own biases guide his actions, and he had failed to treat Maya with the respect she deserved as an FBI agent. This wasn't just about one arrest. It was about a pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed. As the investigation unfolded, more details came to light. It turned out that Officer Harris had a history of making biased judgments, especially when it came to people of color. He had faced complaints in the past, but they had never been fully investigated or addressed. The investigation into Maya's arrest was the catalyst that finally brought his actions to the forefront. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was part of a larger problem. When the department released its findings, the public was shocked. Officer Harris had been placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. The department issued a formal apology to Maya, but it wasn't enough to quiet the growing demand for accountability. People were calling for more than just words. They wanted real change. Maya, however, remained calm. She wasn't interested in public apologies or quick fixes. She was focused on the bigger picture, ensuring that systemic issues within law enforcement were addressed. She had spent her career working for justice, and now she was determined to make sure that justice wasn't just a concept, but something that could be seen in every action taken by officers across the country. As the days passed, Maya's confidence grew. She knew that the truth was on her side, and the truth would set things right. She had the support of her department, her community, and people across the nation who were demanding change. Maya wasn't just going to let this go. It was a turning point, and she was determined to be part of the solution. The wheels of justice were turning slowly, but they were turning. Officer Harris's actions were being exposed, and Maya's courage had inspired others to speak out. The fight for fairness and accountability was gaining momentum, and Maya was at the heart of it. As the investigation continued, things were moving quickly. Officer Harris had been placed on administrative leave, and the department had apologized publicly for his actions. But Maya knew that apologies weren't enough. The real work, the hard work, was just beginning. She wasn't going to let this incident be brushed aside or forgotten. She had seen too many similar situations where the truth got lost, and she wasn't going to let that happen this time. Maya had always believed in the power of accountability. It was one of the core principles of her work as an FBI agent. Justice wasn't just about getting the job done. It was about making sure that everyone, no matter who they were, was held to the same standards. Officer Harris had made a mistake, but his actions were part of a larger problem that needed to be addressed. Despite the public attention and the department's response, Maya had decided to take things into her own hands. She wasn't going to sit back and wait for someone else to make things right. She knew that real change came from within, and she was determined to be part of that change. Instead of taking a backseat to the investigation, Maya chose to speak out publicly. She knew that by sharing her story and raising her voice, she could help bring attention to the broader issue of bias in law enforcement. Her message wasn't just about her own experience. It was about the countless others who had been unfairly treated or wrongfully arrested because of the color of their skin. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," Maya said in an interview with the local news. "This is bigger than just me. It's about making sure that officers are held accountable for their actions and that everyone, no matter who they are, is treated with fairness and respect." Her words struck a chord with the public. People were inspired by her courage to speak out, and they rallied behind her cause. The support was overwhelming, but Maya didn't let it go to her head. She knew that the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. Meanwhile, Officer Harris was facing increasing pressure. His colleagues, the department, and even his family had begun to turn against him. The truth was undeniable. His actions had been wrong, and there was no excuse for the way he had treated Maya. The internal investigation into his past actions revealed a troubling pattern, and soon the department announced that Harris would be facing disciplinary action. Maya's decision to speak out had turned the situation into something much bigger than a simple case of wrongful arrest. It was now a national conversation about race, fairness, and the need for change in law enforcement. Her bravery had started a movement, one that couldn't be ignored. "I never wanted to be a symbol," Maya said in a follow-up interview, "but I knew I couldn't stand by and let this slide. This is about making sure that everyone, no matter their background, is treated fairly." As the story gained momentum, more and more people began to speak up. Activists, leaders, and everyday people joined the cause. Maya had sparked something important, and she knew, deep down, that this was only the start of a much-needed conversation. Change was coming, and Maya Thompson was going to be at the heart of it. Maya's decision to speak out had set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. What started as a simple case of wrongful arrest had turned into a movement for change. Maya wasn't just an FBI agent anymore. She was a leader, an advocate for justice, and a symbol of hope for many. Her courage to stand up in the face of adversity had inspired countless others to do the same. As the weeks passed, the public response continued to grow. People who had never known Maya before were now following her story, supporting her, and spreading her message of fairness and accountability. Activists, community leaders, and even lawmakers began to take notice. Maya had given them a voice that spoke for those who had been ignored, overlooked, or treated unfairly for far too long. The impact was felt across the country. Maya's story was being shared in news articles, social media posts, and television broadcasts. The conversation about race, bias, and accountability in law enforcement had reached a new level, and people were no longer willing to stay silent. Maya's experience had opened the door to important discussions about how law enforcement should be held accountable for their actions and how biases could be addressed within the system. Officer Harris, on the other hand, was facing the consequences of his actions. The department had conducted a thorough investigation into his behavior and discovered a pattern of poor judgment and bias. His past actions were no longer being overlooked, and the department made it clear that there would be consequences. Officer Harris was eventually dismissed from his position, and his case became a reminder of the need for change in law enforcement practices. For Maya, though, this wasn't about one officer's punishment. It was about the larger issue. She had spent her career fighting for justice, and now she was using her platform to make sure that justice was not just an idea, but a reality for everyone. The real work was only just beginning, and Maya knew that change wouldn't come overnight. But she also knew that the first step had already been taken. People were paying attention, and the conversation was finally happening. Maya continued to speak out, attending rallies, giving interviews, and supporting initiatives aimed at reforming law enforcement. Her voice became a powerful tool for those who had been silenced for too long. Her message was clear. Fairness and respect were not optional. They were rights that everyone deserved. In the months that followed, there were changes. Some police departments began to implement new training programs focused on bias reduction and improving relations with communities of color. Activists and community members worked alongside lawmakers to create new policies that would help prevent situations like the one Maya had experienced from happening again. Maya knew that the fight wasn't over. There was still much to be done, but she also knew that her decision to speak out had made a real difference. It had sparked a movement, and that movement was changing the world for the better. Maya had turned her painful experience into a force for good, and she would continue to lead the way toward a more just and fair future for everyone.